But my name is Maddie Capshaw. I'm the project manager on Virginity side. So once again, welcome. So for tonight's agenda, we're just going to kind of go over a little bit of the project overview for the comprehensive plan. We'll have the presentation by Kevin, and then we'll get into some of the next steps that we'll be going throughout the project. So the project timeline, we're very closely nearing the end of phase one. This is a 5-phase project, so we're in the assess phase. This is where we're in our data collection, kind of getting some preliminary ideas and things like that. Our next phase is kicking off in December, and that's going to go through March of next year. This is going to be our explore phase, where we're really working into some of the data that we've collected and really seeing kind of like the baseline elements and things that we discovered in the assess phase. And then we have our third phase that we'll be getting into, which is our organize phase, where we really start putting those ideas together. Our fourth phase is our prioritize phase. That one is where we really, it's pretty self-explanatory, but we start prioritizing those ideas and the recommendations that we're coming up with. And then our last phase, which goes through December of 2025 through March 2026, is our adopt phase. And it's also self-explanatory, but that's where we'll be taking the actual plan to adoption. Okay, well, went through that pretty quick, but I'll go ahead and hand it off to Kevin now so we can go ahead and get started with going through some of this really awesome, important information.
So a comprehensive plan talks about the future growth and development of your community. And for those of you who have followed the process so far, maybe going back to the kickoff conversations, maybe even some of the website stuff that you've interacted with, our firm's approach to every comp plan that we do is about growing in a fiscally sustainable way, growing in a way that your city can afford to continue to provide services and infrastructure going forward, but also keeping it affordable for residents as well. And so kind of the central element or the focus piece of all of our work is what we call a land use fiscal analysis. It's where we look at the tax productivity of the development pattern. We look at how different development in the community is doing in terms of revenue per acre, what it costs to serve, things of that nature. But before we show that, which we'll do later in November, we'll actually show the results of the analysis for Garland. We'd like to have a conversation just about some concepts that I've learned over the years working locally and across the country, and what it's going to mean for this process for you all, and give you all the opportunity to ask some questions on these concepts before you see the real numbers for Garland. So a couple of questions to think about as we get started. So does your city here, does Garland have the money it needs to pay for services and infrastructure? Those of you that are here in person, raise your hand if you feel like the city has the money it needs. Number two, can everyone who wants to live in your community afford a home? Right? Number three, can locals in your community build wealth, or do the development policies and incentives favor larger outside developers and businesses? And number four, do you have a common language in your community with shared values and decision-making principles that are used consistently when you have conversations about growth and development, and especially when your decisions are being made about what projects are being improved, what infrastructure you're investing in? If you don't have that consistent common language, you need to. And so I'm going to talk about some of this. So going back, I mentioned this quickly in the first presentation, but my background is in civil engineering. We're taught in engineering school to design bigger, better growth. A lot of, at the time I went through school and the work that I did in the engineering portion of my career, it was very much auto-centric growth, suburban style growth. Here in North Texas, it was very rapid growth as well. But in 2008, 2009, I switched. I got in a bit of a hybrid role and then transitioned full-time into national director of my former firm's community planning practice. And so I went from the engineering world to the planning world, working with cities all over the country. And something that started to emerge to me as I was working on comp plans like this, downtown plans, sustainability plans, all kinds of plans, but was no matter where I went, if it was a big city or a small city, rural, urban, suburban, no matter where I went, very few cities had the money that they needed to pay for their infrastructure. Streets, water, sewer, drainage, parks. And when you dig a little bit more, what the mayors and the city managers would say, we're trying to keep up with all of these growing wants and needs of our community with limited resources. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about these resource and affordability gaps as we go through here, but But that process of working around the country, seeing this infrastructure and housing affordability gap emerging in different places, and then coming back to North Texas and thinking, why or what are we doing differently that's going to keep us from ending up like a Shreveport, a Memphis, a Detroit, if you want to go that big, a Ferguson, Flint, Jackson, all of these places that you see on the news that are having failures, whether it's bankruptcies, soft defaults, infrastructure failings. It all comes back to the development pattern. It all comes back to the rate and pattern that they grew, and their service and tax structure. So ultimately, 2011, that led me to leave, start Verdunity. We focused really the first, 8 years or so completely in Texas, and now this whole fiscal sustainability thing is starting to get out to other places as well. So we're venturing out to other parts of the country as well, even though I promised my wife when I started Verdunity that I was trying to get out of that whole travel thing. So here we are again. When you look at a city's website, when you look at their strategic plan or maybe a previous comprehensive plan, you'll see some version of these things. We want to be fiscally solvent or fiscally responsible or fiscally sustainable. We want to be environmentally resilient. We want to be socially inclusive. We want to preserve a high quality of life. We want to provide affordable housing for everyone. You'll see versions of this, right? But when you look at the daily decisions that are made, when you look at those projects that are approved, the infrastructure that we build, the housing developments that we build, they don't always align with those outcomes. And so we have fragile local economies and city budgets. We've got deteriorating infrastructure. We've got growing affordability gaps. We've got some unsafe neighborhoods. We've got frustrated residents that can really take the form of everything from apathy to heck, I'm just not even going to spend time anymore, to flat out anger, right? The whole spectrum. When I say frustrated residents, there's a whole spectrum in there based on what the issue is and where you are. But when you talk to folks inside City Hall, especially planners that are doing this kind of work, you'll hear that we're administering outdated zoning codes or outdated development standards and policies that are creating these generic places that are unsafe in some ways. And really, when it gets down to it, residents and businesses struggle to connect with these places. And if you struggle to really deeply connect with somewhere, you're not going to reinvest in it, right? As soon as your house starts to get older, or as soon as a Walmart and the big box starts to outlive its life, you're going to pick up and go to the next new place. Now in Texas, what that means for us is what? Out to the next ring, and out to the next ring, and out to the next ring. Well, if you talk to folks over at our regional MPO, our planning organization for North Texas, they will tell you that if you look at North Texas as an area, it's starting to look awfully similar to Detroit. Detroit became a donut, right? The very, very core had a lot of resources in it, and the very edges had a lot of resource and investment in it, and the middle ring hollowed out, right? People either moved back into the core or they moved out into the newest suburbs on the edge. North Texas is starting to look like that as well. And so when you think about water, when you think about transportation infrastructure and what it takes to sustain our system, whether you're at a city level, a county level, TxDOT, the water districts that provide water, they all have a funding gap. They all have massive needs that they have to take care of, and nowhere near enough money to take care of it. So I already kind of talked about this, but as I was working around the country and still today, I ask city managers and mayors, what's the biggest challenge when it comes to managing growth and development in your community? The majority will say some version of this. How do we keep up with the growing wants and needs of our community with the limited resources that we have? And it's really interesting when you think about this in the context of shifting from a growth community where you're rapid growth and you have a lot of new revenue coming in to a redevelopment or an infill kind of community where Garland is, and most of your city is built out and has to be maintained and ultimately replaced. It's a very different conversation. And in Texas, we're just now starting to get there versus a lot of these places I worked with around the country that really made the light bulb go off for me. So this is the question that I was asking back in 2010, 2011. With all the wealth and growth that we've experienced in this country, why are our cities struggling to pay for basic infrastructure? bad management. And so this was, I mentioned, this was what I was doing before I had my aha moment. I was designing neighborhood streets for cities all over North Texas, worked on a few high-profile highway projects like the one you see on the right. That was probably the coolest project that I ever touched as an engineer. I got in a lot of trouble as a young engineer working out in Vegas. You can only imagine a single engineer in Vegas. But, again, in engineering school, we're taught how to design these things. We're not taught how are we going to pay to maintain after it's built, right? I give a lot of talks at schools now to engineering groups and to planning groups, for that matter, about this stuff, because it's just not something that we've thought about in this country until here more recently. So this happened. Y'all remember that, right? And so this was, I remember at my old job, I mean, it was just a matter of weeks. We had fax machines back then, and this started to happen, and we started to get fax after fax after fax with city projects being shut down, TxDOT projects being shut down, county projects being shut down. And our whole architecture engineering world came to a complete stop in the matter of 3 weeks. And I remember then thinking this is crazy fragile, right? And then shortly after that, we pumped some stimulus money in and all things go back to normal, right? This is another thing I saw working around the country, the fragile economies and local bankruptcies. Everybody's heard of Detroit. We all know about Detroit. I like to talk about San Bernardino here. My dad worked for Shell growing up. We lived all over the place. One of the places we lived was San Bernardino. We lived there in the late 70s, 78, 77 to 79, I think it was. But at the time that we lived there, it was best place to live, work, play, rapidly growing community, brand new neighborhoods, brand new schools, brand new businesses, everything that we talk about, in our North Texas suburbs today, right? In 2011, they filed for bankruptcy. Stockton, same story. Suburban area filed for bankruptcy. I think this is from 2019. I could add way more to this now. And there's a whole next group of cities and counties that are teetering right underneath that line. And what you're seeing with those is it's kind of like, y'all remember the story about Flint, Michigan with the water, and Jackson, Mississippi, right? Those are basically soft defaults. When a city doesn't have the money it needs to maintain basic infrastructure like water, right, and things fail, that's a soft default. It's not a hard bankruptcy, but it's still, they're not able to provide and continue basic services. There's a lot of cities around this country that are right on that line. All they need is one weather event, one bad pipe, and down it goes. I'm not going to be all doom and gloom tonight, I promise. We also have increasing affordability gaps. We're all aware of it. We're talking about it here in Texas. We saw it on both coasts first, but now we're seeing it here. If you don't build enough supply, if you don't build enough housing units, the value of the housing that you have is going to continue to get pushed up. It's a supply and demand conversation. And something that we're struggling with in Texas is how do you provide the supply for so many people in this region, in the land that we have, with the infrastructure that we have, with the budgets that we have to work with. So we're going to talk a lot about housing options as we go through this process as well. So this is kind of what I saw, right? I saw aging parts of the country. I come back to Texas, where we've got this fast growth, and really when you study communities across the whole country, really what you see is post-World War II, after the invention of the car and with some of the housing policies that were happening at that time, cities all over this country, and especially in Texas, started to aggressively pursue this fast growth model, the higher quality of life, building a whole bunch of subdivisions all at once in the short term without fully considering the long-term costs and impacts. And so I started to ask this, I saw this, and then I started to come back here and started to challenge cities to ask this question. Well, what about maintenance after growth? Things are easy when you're growing. You've got additional tax revenue coming in, you've got people coming in, you've got businesses wanting to come to your community. But when that growth flattens out and all of a sudden those places need reinvestment, right? Does your city have what it needs to maintain everywhere? Do they have to pick certain neighborhoods? And this is what happens. You see great neighborhoods that they don't get that reinvestment, and the people who have the wealth and the means to do so will move out, and the ones who don't have the means to do it get stuck, right? And on the right, you see some commercial options, whether it's strip centers, whether it's big malls. We're starting to see these all over the country, that they're abandoned in favor of new greenfield commercial developments, mostly out on the edge as well. So I would argue that we're building cities that we can't afford to live in as residents, and we can't afford to maintain them as cities. Not everywhere, but the vast majority of communities in this country are somewhere in this situation. Some I think are salvageable, some are toast. Luckily for us, most of our cities in Texas are still salvageable because we are blessed to have so many resources and growth still happening. So this is a group, Strongtowns. Strongtowns.org is their website. They're a nonprofit group that talks a lot about these same development concepts. I would strongly encourage anybody that's listening or watching here tonight or watches this later, go check them out. They have a ton of content that they push out with videos, podcasts, books, all kinds of stuff. Chuck is someone I met back in 2010 when I was struggling with these things. He and I are good friends and do a lot of collaboration together today. But this quote from him really sums up what our challenge is, and it talks about the way that our cities account for infrastructure. We show infrastructure on our books at the city level as a depreciating asset. So when we build a road, it's viewed as an asset to our community, right? And so over the life of it, that value just appreciates. At the end of that life, we don't have anything on our books to account for what the cost is to rebuild that street or water line or drainage pipe or whatever. They should be accounted for as deferred liabilities. We should have a number on our books out in the future that says when this road gets to the end of its life cycle, we have that 2 million, 10 million, whatever it is to rebuild that road. So he asked, how come they don't do that? That has to get into fiscal policies with cities. There's a lot of conversations about changing this right now. Yes, sir.
Does deferred liability imply if there's a cash escrow account or whatever that's sitting aside there to fund that deferred liability? Numbers.
That is an excellent question. That is an excellent question. He asks does a deferred liability imply that there's a fund that money is going into and being saved up to account for that cost in the future? And the answer is no. So this is what Chuck's getting at here is basically we have this iceberg, right? We have all of this infrastructure, and I'm going to unpack this more in a little bit. We have all of this infrastructure that gets built in the growth mode, and it's just like ticking away, and then boom, we've got to maintain it. And do our cities have the money? And in most cases they don't, because in our growth mode, and I'm getting way ahead of myself in this presentation, but in growth mode, what do our councils want to do when we're growing and we have surplus revenue? Or lower the tax rate, right? They get a lot of pressure to lower the tax rate. That's an easy way to get elected or reelected, especially today. So one of the things I learned talking with Chuck and working around the country is this connection between our development pattern, the rate and the pattern that we build our cities, and the long-term fiscal health of them. So this is the historic development pattern, right? This is pre-World War II. This is the way we built our cities before we had a car, right? Most of the cities all over this country, even here in Garland, the square, right? We had a place, a few people came together and said, we want to live and work here. They would build a few buildings and they started to do their thing. Over time, more people would want to come, and the city would grow incrementally out, incrementally up, and a little incrementally more intense, right? As they had the resources and the people to do so. There was no debt, there was no financing, there were no special design guidelines or anything like that. We just built it incrementally as we had the need and the resources to do it, right? So over time, this is Chuck's hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota, an old kind of lumber town. That little small street turns into this, right? If I showed you a picture of this street today, it's depressing as heck. You know what it is? It's a 6-lane road with parking lots on both sides. and a bunch of vacant buildings. This was a vibrant town. This was a very active community. You can see all the different people and types of transportation they had in the street. You can see all kinds of different building structures here. Lots of residential, commercial, all mixed together, all close together so that people could walk between them, right? This is probably my favorite street I've ever been to. This is in Indianapolis, Indiana, but you can see signs of traditional or historic development here. On the right, you see front porches, right? We used to design our neighborhoods with front porches to have, quote, eyes on the street, right? Everybody was out on the front porches. Everybody knew each other because we all saw each other walking by. You know, I remember growing up in a neighborhood in Illinois, we would walk home from school, and we had an old lady that she was always out on her front porch offering us lemonade. We would go hang out with her for like an hour almost every day after school and get all kinds of stories from her. I learned some of the most amazing stuff from that woman. And like I try to tell my kids that story today, and they don't have that. We have designed that out of our neighborhoods, right? The boogeyman lives next door. Why does the boogeyman live next door? Because we don't even know who lives next door half the time. So we're going to assume the worst, right? On the left side, what do you notice about this street? It's pretty narrow, isn't it? Right? That forces cars to drive slow. If you want cars to drive slow in a neighborhood, narrow the street and put all kinds of stuff right up close to it. You will force cars to drive slow. Now, the engineers and the old engineer in me would tell you don't do that. Spread everything out and push it all out because that makes it safer for the drivers, right? So there's a lot of things here. The other thing I'll point out is the street trees on the left. One of the easy ways to see an old neighborhood from a new neighborhood is where are those street trees at? Are they up closer to the sidewalk in the street where they're shading the street in the public realm, or are they pushed way up in the yard where they shade the yard and actually get into your foundation? Right? I mean, I live in one of those subdivisions right now, and it's driving me batty because I have these huge trees in my yard, but it's hard to keep the grass there, and they're getting into my foundation and busting up our steps up to the house. But so this is the traditional pattern, right? Very compact, mix of uses, mostly walkable. Very heavy attention to detail with the architecture, with the aesthetics of places. They're all designed intentionally to make them visually appealing as you're walking around. So this is post-World War II suburban development, right? This is where we could go buy up 100 acres and we could knock out a whole bunch of homes all at once in a matter of a year. And when you build a whole bunch of residential like this, where everyone has to drive around, what does that do to the stuff on the right, right? If everybody's driving around everywhere, it requires more and more roads, more and more intersections, more and more highways, and it leads to more of the big box commercial market, right? Where you have big box stores that draw from people all around versus those local stores that just draw from a smaller area. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay. So let's think about this in the context of the rate and the pattern of growth and what that means for our cities. If you look at this chart, you start on the left, you're a small town. Garland was a small town. You had the square, maybe a few neighborhoods around it, you had a little bit of infrastructure, and you kind of went a while, right, before you really kind of hit growth mode. So that infrastructure around your square gets a little bit older, and then you kind of get in the middle of this curve. When did Garland go through their big growth spurt? I don't know off the top of my head, but 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s? Okay. So market comes to you, you're in your growth mode, developers come in, they start to crank out the subdivisions, right? And so all of the roads and the water and the sewer and the parks and the commercial, everything starts to come in a matter of, usually when you study a lot of cities, it's a matter of 2 decades, 15 to 20, maybe 25 years. Lots of growth in a short amount of time. This tends to be what I call the best place to live, work, play phase of a city. You drive around town and you see mostly new neighborhoods and new stuff, and maybe that old historic part of town, or that old part of town, the original part of town, it's historic, right? It's touristy now because it's kind of got that old feel to it and people want to go there and kind of visit. And if you have to maintain some of that oldest infrastructure, you have the revenue from so much new growth that you can go take care of those few, streets that were built back in the 20s or 30s, right? But as you continue to the right of this curve, you start to run out of land to develop. Garland is there, right? You don't have a lot of greenfield vacant land left to build on. So the revenue from new development slows down. The additional property tax revenue, the additional sales tax revenue, building permit revenue, impact fee, all of that revenue that comes from new growth starts to slow down, right? How long does a street last? Anybody know? 30 to 50 years, yeah. Depending on how, if it's asphalt concrete, how well it was built, anywhere from 20 to 50. Older streets, you're really lucky if they get to 50 years. But so when was the growth? The 50s and 60s, right? In Garland, maybe into the 70s. So if you drive around a lot of those neighborhoods that were built, what do they look like today? A little tired, right? And so imagine all over your city, if you build so much of your growth in that 20-year period, and then all of that infrastructure, especially streets, has to be rebuilt. It tends to happen kind of at the same time. Your revenues start to flatten out, and a lot of those maintenance and reconstruction needs start to hit your city, right? This is Detroit, this is Flint, Ferguson, Missouri, Shreveport, Memphis. So most cities aren't thinking about that far right. They're not thinking about what do we do when we're past preventative maintenance or just fixing potholes or replacing a panel here or there. I'm talking this road is toast, the whole thing's got to be rebuilt or mostly rebuilt. What are we doing for that? Not just on one or two streets, or even, let's say 5% of our city's streets as part of a bond program. But I'm talking about the whole thing, right? So let's look at the footprint here. So the rate of growth is one thing. If you build most of your city in a short amount of time, you can expect a lot of that infrastructure to have to be fixed in the same amount of time. It's just going to come 30 to 50 years later, right? The second thing is the growth or the land footprint. This is from Victoria, Texas. I like to use this one just because it's very clear to illustrate the issue. We're building this for Garland as well, and we'll talk about it in that next presentation that we do. But if you look at the green part kind of right down in the bottom there, that's the original part of Victoria, Texas. If you look real closely, you can kind of see the gridded network of streets kind of coming through that green, right? So this was your traditional grid, narrow streets, mix of small and big lots, mix of different uses, that walkable, compact, traditional pattern. Then if you look at the yellow, orange, and red that goes out from that, that's 1950 and on. So think about when you expand your city out in that kind of footprint, what comes with it? All of the roads, all of the water, the sewer, the police, the fire, the parks. All of that stuff has to be served and maintained, right? So when you grow outward, you're taking off on a lot more service area, which is a lot more cost to serve and maintain. At the same time, we've been doing this in a lower density development pattern, so larger lots, more suburban spread out pattern, right? And so when you add more cost and you lower the dwelling units per acre or the households per acre, what happens? The cost per household goes up, right? But the catch is our cities aren't accounting for the full cost of that extra infrastructure. All we're doing is accounting for, look at the new growth, look at the revenue side, look at the additional property tax, look at the sales tax, right? We're not thinking about what it's going to take to maintain those streets and water and sewer on the back end. So in Victoria's case, 1950 to 2015, their service area grew by 13 times, the population grew by 4 times. So this is another metric that we look at. How big is your city limit area, your service area growing? And how does that compare to the density of your city? And density gets a lot of bad reviews from people sometimes. But one thing I can tell you with confidence is density pays the bills. Density generates much more revenue per acre than spread out development. And if you do it well, the revenues can cover the additional costs that come with some of the more compact development as well, which I'm going to get into more as I go through this. So this is another thing that we started to do just to kind of help communities and residents and staff kind of understand this dynamic here. We'll just pick certain streets. This isn't the best example. I like to use cul-de-sac streets because it's very easy to say all of the properties on this cul-de-sac street are the only ones benefiting from this street, right? But essentially what we do is look at a street, look at the cost to replace that street. In this case, this street was going to cost a little over $1 million to replace. It's asphalt, so they were expecting to get 25 to 30 years out of it, right? If you look at the property tax revenue that's generated from those properties served by that street, in this case, they were getting an annual property tax revenue of just under $18,000 from those properties being served by that street. If 100% of the property tax revenue from these properties went to nothing but that street, it would take 58 years to pay it off. How long does that street last? Right? How much of Garland's property tax revenue goes to streets? Anybody know? I can tell you it's not 100%, right? It's usually, most cities are 4, 5, maybe 10% goes towards streets, just out of the general fund, and then there's some additional bond money on top of that that goes towards some. But we do a lot of examples in this, and sometimes there's some streets that they'll kind of break even, they'll pay for themselves, right? But by and large, most of the time, we think when we build roads that it is going to generate the revenue to pay for that street. And in most cases, it doesn't. And so it has to be subsidized from other things, sales tax or other sources, or we just don't fix all of our streets. So what are our options to close these resource gaps? There's really 3. The first is increase taxes and fees. That's not the most popular option, right? It does happen. It does tend to happen a lot when you get in a little more desperate, older kind of cities and they don't have a choice. You'll see street assessments. I can tell you one example from South Dakota. They were behind. They went out and did a street assessment, which basically says, here's what this street is going to cost to replace. The city paid for half of it. The other half got divvied up across all of the properties on that street. Every property owner got a bill in their mailbox, and they had 1 year to pay it. So another extreme example, Omaha, Nebraska, which is actually growing and doing quite well. They actually had some of their streets that they intentionally let go back to gravel to not maintain them. So Memphis, Tennessee is shrinking the size of their city. Their whole last comp plan was about reducing the size of their city to fit the revenues they had so they could provide better service to a smaller area. The second option is reduce services. This is basically what we're doing today. When we do a capital improvement program or a bond election or an annual city budget, we have a certain amount of revenue, right? And we match our services or we match our expenses to fit that revenue. For a capital improvement program, the engineering department may come to you and say, we have $500 million worth of needs, and 25% of that is the stuff that we absolutely have to take care of. And then, we can only do a bond election to cover 10% of that. And then anything we don't fund gets deferred to the next year and the next year. And unfortunately, when we defer those things, what you see is the next time you do one, the costs are more. Either you have the same amount and the costs have just gotten higher due to inflation, or you actually have a lot more that's starting to fail as well. So neither one of those are really good options if you want to build a vibrant, sustainable place. The third option is developing more productively. How can you develop in a way that aligns the revenue productivity of your development with and the services that are required with what your residents are willing and able to pay for, not just today, but in the future? In general, what developing more productively means is this. We've got to get a balance. You don't have to go all the way from one to the other, but we have to get a better balance between designing auto-centric places for cars and designing places that are scaled for humans, right? We're not everywhere, not every city is going to be 100% walkable and complete and mixed use and all of that. But the only way to make things pencil on the left side of that, if you're a very suburban, spread out place that's completely auto-centric, is home values have to be really, really high, and your infrastructure has to be pretty minimal. So asphalt streets and bar ditches, septic, right? So we've swung way too far to the left of this. We got to get back in the middle. And doing this requires trade-offs. This is probably one of the most valuable slides that we have, and something that we will continue to talk through all the way through this process. There are trade-offs when you think about development. How many of you want stable services, right? You want to have predictable, reliable police and fire, right? You want to have your water work when you turn it on. You want to have your toilet flush. Everybody wants those things, right? How many of you want low taxes? We all want that too, right? Okay, here's the catch. How many of you want low density? Most of you probably do, right? It doesn't exist, man. It just, especially when you think about long-term costs, it's really, unless you're out in a rural neighborhood and your definition of stable services is you're okay if it takes 30 minutes for the fire department to get there, then it might work, right? So you can play with these. You can have lower density, higher values, and maybe because of the higher values, they pay more in taxes. And that's what makes it work. If you want stable services and low taxes, higher density is the path to get there. But higher density doesn't always equate to stable services, because there's a quality of life thing in there that a lot of people get. So we use this a lot of different ways to talk about different types of neighborhoods and what it means to quality of life, and especially what it means to different generations and what they're looking for. So how do we talk about these things? How do we talk about land use and growth management and street design and housing in a way that most people can connect with? Fiscal sustainability is a common language. I mentioned on that very first slide, what are some of the questions that you're asking, and does your community have a common language that's used to frame discussions and inform decisions? A question you will hear myself, you'll hear Maddie, every member of our team ask through this process: okay, Mr. Smith, I hear that you want to do that. How are we going to pay for that? How's the city going to pay for that, and how are you going to pay for that? Right? Okay, city, you want to do this. How are you, the city, going to pay for that? It has a way of kind of cutting right to the heart of the issue. And I'll compare, the analogy I'll give is buying a car. If I came to any of you guys and said, you're going to buy a car tomorrow, what kind of car are you going to buy? Right? That's the only criteria. You might say, I want to go get a Lamborghini. I want to go get a minivan. I don't know. But if I said, you're married, you have 3 kids, you live 45 minutes from work, and you make $70,000 a year, now what kind of car are you going to go buy? Very different conversation, right? That's what this planning process is going to be about. When we ask about how is Garland going to grow, how are you going to pay for it? How's the city going to pay for it? How are you, the residents, going to pay for it? And a lot of this process gets, honestly, we have to, as a culture, we really have to adjust our expectations for what we can get for our money, especially when it comes to housing and transportation. We have, as a country, have been living far, far, far beyond our means, and now it's kind of coming due. Okay, so how do we do this in a comp plan, right? How do we do this in a comprehensive plan, or as part of a looking at how a city develops? Land use fiscal analysis is the way that we do that. We do these as standalone analyses. We do them a lot as part of comprehensive plans. We can do them sometimes as part of a budget exercise, especially with zoning conversations about bigger lots versus smaller lots and mixed use development versus big box commercial, things like that. The first thing I want you to understand, and again, in the next presentation, we're going to show Garland's results. So we're going to show you Garland's actual numbers and math and performance and talk about that. But tonight, I'm just going to talk about some of the concepts so you can start to think about this. And this is really, really important, both for the staff in the back and also for residents, is when we start asking you about what kind of development can go here, and what kind of development do you want to support, and what kind of mobility options do you want to consider, what kind of housing do you want to consider, I want you to be thinking about it through these kind of metrics. So the first one is thinking about, the value of property, right? When we talk about how valuable a property is, we tend to think about what's the assessed value. This property is on the tax rolls for $1 million, right? Or 2 million or whatever. That does account for the size of the property a little bit. But what we do is put it in terms of per acre. So you take the value of a property, you divide it by the size of the property, and you get a value per acre metric, right? These two maps that you see on the right are both for Dallas County, and you can see a very different picture. The darker the green, the more valuable the property is. The top one is assessed value, and you can see that there's high value properties scattered all over Dallas County, right? But when we put it in terms of value per acre, look where the investment in Dallas County is happening, between 75 and 35, right? Anybody that's lived in Dallas for a while knows about the lack, or has heard about the lack of investment in southern Dallas. I have not found a map or a graphic that shows the problem any more clearly than this one does, right? So the first thing is value per acre. It lets us look at development in an apples to apples kind of way. The next thing we do is we map this different ways. So we can do it in two-dimensional, top-down maps like this. We can also do it in 3D. Anybody know where downtown Dallas is? Right? In these maps, the higher the bars, the more valuable, the higher value per acre. So, and I'm going to get into why this is, but what's interesting looking at it at a county level like this is you start to see how much power the metro centers of our regions really generate in terms of generating wealth for our region, right? The other thing that you see is you start to look at first and second and third ring suburbs through here. And there's some, I pick on Cedar Hill sometimes because I know those folks down there, I like them, but I don't know if you, can y'all? Yeah, okay, right there. See that little bit of green right there? So Cedar Hill is a pretty affluent, fast growing third ring suburb. But look at the size of those bars compared to downtown Dallas, right? Even compared to Las Colinas and the Irving area. Garland has some places that do pretty well on this. So the 3D maps, these are going to become pretty important to look at. We'll do these in a dynamic way where you can zoom in and out and spin them around, all kinds of good stuff. The next thing that we do, so we just look at the revenue per acre. So we look at what's the property tax revenue per acre for every property in the city. Then we take the budget and we say what portion of the general fund budget is paid for from property taxes, and we allocate that back to the properties, right? So every property has a revenue number and then they have a cost associated with it from the general fund. And this leads to a net per acre. If you're green in this scenario, you're generating more revenue than you cost to serve. If you're red, you cost more to serve than you're generating in revenue, right? For current budget conditions. If you were to roll this all up citywide, you're still going to have revenues and expenditures are going to be even. But you can start to look property by property here how things change, right? In this case, this is from Brownsville, Texas. Before I show you the next one, I will tell you for them, and again, I like to include, in this general presentation, I like to include slides that help me explain the concepts, which tends to mean they're pretty dramatic, right? When we worked with Brownsville back in 2017, just to rebuild all of the streets in that city, they needed $1.2 billion, $65 million a year on average. They were spending $3 million, right? Big gap. So the next level, so we show how are your properties doing with current budget conditions. This is what you have today. The next thing we do is say, if your street had the money, what would it take to rebuild all of the streets in Garland, right, on average, and we add that in. That's what Brownsville looked like when we added in the unfunded deferred street liabilities. So it went from this to that, right? This is what they really need. This is how their development is really performing. And so what you can do here is you start to zoom in and say, okay, the properties and developments that stayed green, even when we loaded more costs on, why? Right? Why did some areas stay green while others went red? So let's look value development patterns. We're going to get into some things like this too, but if we just look at the value side, couple of different examples here. Rural with some infrastructure, suburban single family, and then townhomes on the right. Look at the value per acre difference between those three. Okay, this has nothing to do with cost. All this is just taxable value per acre. So without changing the tax rate at all, you don't change the tax rate at all, the townhomes are going to generate much more property tax revenue to the city than either of the other two, right? Yes, there are costs that go to this. And yes, a lot of people will say the more dense development you need, it adds more costs. Not always, sometimes. And even if it does, the additional revenue that you get from this more compact development will cover those additional costs. Versus the two on the left, the one on the far left, if it's estate lots and has very, very high value homes on it, like I said earlier, it could potentially pencil out. The stuff in the middle is really hard to make pencil until you start to get to average home values of 6, 7, 800,000. So a lot of folks that are living in suburban single family that got in for a $200,000 or maybe a $300,000 home, and they're complaining that their values are going up. All that's happening is the market is getting to what those homes really are worth with land values and what they really take to serve. So one of the questions that we're exploring with all the work that we do is, how are people going to start to move around when the way that they've been living may not be what they can afford going forward? Second is on the commercial side, same thing. Suburban pad side on the left, big box in the middle, and a traditional downtown grid in the middle, or in the right. The middle and the right ones are basically the same area. The difference here is the big box, the majority of that area is taken up with a parking lot. The one on the right is made up mostly of buildings, right? And you may ask, well, what about parking? Everybody's parking, the big box has that, for people to park. Well, in the traditional grid, it's a combination of on-street parking that's kind of dispersed across the whole area, and maybe you do have a garage in there somewhere as well. But the traditional on the right is that more compact, that they can get a lot of walkable traffic. They can get a lot of business happening from people that live and work right around there, right? Versus the big box, because of that autocentric pattern, it has to draw people from a wide area, which is why they have the bigger parking lot. So density, if you think about affordability for households, what's your per household cost? Here's, again, kind of a bit of an extreme example, but 2 blocks, the infrastructure is the same, right? The road out in front is the same. Think about just your typical residential block. The street, the water, sewer, everything out in front is the same, right? If you just have a couple of houses on that block, all of those costs, those street costs, have to be shared between those 2 houses in the bottom one, right? The top one, if you put a mix of homes, maybe you put some accessory dwelling units in there, you put a duplex, you put a quadplex, you put a couple of single families in there, nothing crazy, just going back to that traditional mixed use kind of development pattern, right? Then you can spread those costs out across more households. So that cost per household comes down. So the density of development has a direct relationship to what the household liability is. We don't talk about that enough, right? We just say, in this scenario, everybody here pays the same amount, right? And so the ones that tend to be in the smaller homes and the more compact neighborhoods, in a weird kind of way, are subsidizing the homes on the bigger lots. That is sometimes hard for people to understand. So a couple other graphics that we put together. So 31-foot wide residential street, this is pretty typical. Sometimes they're even wider than this in a suburban context. 70-foot lots. So on this 1,000-foot block, you've got 14 lots, right? Or I'm sorry, 28. You got 14 on each side. 28 lots total. Take the cost of that street, you divide it by 28 lots, and it comes out to about $19,000 per lot to replace that street. If we narrow that a little bit, if we just narrow that street 4 feet, and we narrow those lots to 50s, you get 40 lots on that. That drops the cost per lot down to just under $12,000, right? So another thing, the width of street, the width of pavement. Pavement costs roughly anywhere from $1 to $2 million per 11-foot lane mile. right? So for one mile of an 11-foot lane, it's between $1 and $2 million to replace. I'm going to just do easy math. Say all of your residential streets in Garland are 33 feet wide, 3 lanes, right? That's somewhere between $3 to $6 million a mile to replace. Now add up all of the miles of residential street in Garland, right? And that's just the street. That's not water, sewer that are done with enterprise funds. That's not drainage or parks. That's just the streets. So again, some assumptions in here, but basically what this is showing, so that the top row is the biggest, the widest streets, the biggest lots. If you had a 0.5 tax rate and 10% of your property tax went to streets, the average home value there would need to be $760,000, right? The narrow street, narrow lot, the average home value would have to be $475,000. That's if 10% of your property tax revenue went to streets, right? So how do we increase revenue, right? The revenue side of the equation. On the cost side, if we reduce streets, we can take, as we rebuild them, we can take a big chunk out of things. But on the revenue side, a couple of things. Lot coverage is one. Basically, the more building you put on a lot, the more revenue it's going to generate, right? If you have parking lots, if you have bigger yards, that value per acre is going to go down. The second one is height. This is easier for folks to understand. Think about a 1-story versus a 2-story house, right? The more stories you go, the more value you're gonna generate. Small development. This is something that we recommend a lot, both because it closes the revenue gap for cities, but it also starts to introduce that affordability, addressing that affordability challenge that we have too. This is held true in every city we've ever modeled, all across Texas and in other states. What you're seeing here, the size of the lots goes across the bottom. So the smaller lots are on the left, the biggest lots are on the right. The purple, blue bars, that shows the average value, the average structural value or the average home value on each of those different lot sizes. This is from Taylor, Texas, I believe, outside of Austin. And then that blue line is the revenue per acre, right? And so everywhere we've ever done this, the revenue per acre will go down from the smallest lots have the highest revenue per acre, the largest lots have the lowest revenue per acre. So that smallest lot has the highest tax revenue per acre to the city, and it's the most affordable to build and to live in, right? This has really started to explode with COVID, right? Businesses, this also holds true for commercial, right? Think about all the spaces in your downtown, those 25 by 100-foot spaces, right? Those are the highest property tax revenue per acre in the city, way more than any of the other kind of commercial that you have. They're also more affordable because they're smaller, right? So it's a big win-win getting more of this small development. Unfortunately, a lot of the cities that we work with, the zoning codes do not allow those smaller lots to be built. A lot of cities that pull us in are actually, the conversation is going, we want to raise the minimum lot size. We want to make our lots bigger, right? And what they end up doing is developers get kind of squeezed into that middle one, which is an absolute money pit for cities because it has the most infrastructure, the most land usage, and the home values, unless they continue to go up, don't cover it. So how do we translate this into the plan? These are steps that we're going to work through with you all. We're doing the baseline analysis right now. That's what we're going to present next month, so you can show just how is the pattern, how is Garland performing right now? Where are the productive places, where are the places that are struggling, and why, right? From there, we're going to look at projecting trends. So based on the streets that you have, based on the budget that you have, based on some of the affordability trends that you have, what happens to those deferred liabilities? What does the city need to be saving or spending for future infrastructure? And then when we look at the growth management, the land use and growth management, what kind of infill strategies? Typically, the simplest thing I can say if you want to close gaps is work inside out. So you start at the core of the city and you add density, you work outward from there. Anywhere that has services, that has infrastructure, if it's vacant lots, you got to get buildings on it, right? And start to make those neighborhoods more compact and more complete and thicken them up a little bit. And then you just have to know what neighborhoods are going to stay the same. What neighborhoods are we not going to touch? The residents, the city, everybody agrees we're going to keep these exactly the way they are. You just got to know what those generate and know what they cost, and the rest of the city has to be planned to manage to that. And then the last part is coming through. Once we do the land use plan, we show the kind of the future growth strategies that the community's helped inform, then we'll run numbers again and say, where does this put you? Does this close your gap? Does it make it bigger? Hopefully we do our job and we get to a place that closes your gap, or at least moves you in that kind of direction. A couple of the strategies that you can expect to hear us talk about: building more complete neighborhoods. Missing middle housing is a term that basically talks about everything between the big, huge apartment complex and the single family lot, right? They're everything from cottages to duplexes, triplexes, smallplex, live work units. There's a lot of different kind of housing that you'll see, especially up in the Northeast, that it's at different sizes, it's at different price points, and it serves multiple generations of a family, so that as you go up, you go and you get into a suburban single family home because you got 3 kids and you need the space. Then you want to downsize, you don't want the yard, whatever, right? Our cities in North Texas need to do a better job of providing some of these different kinds of housing, so that as our demographics are changing, which they are, we have a lot more older folks, we have a lot more younger folks that don't want anything to do with the suburbs. They grew up in the suburbs, they never want to go back, right? I think I mentioned last time, my wife is a counselor and she talks with a lot of families and kids. And the kids growing up in the suburbs will tell you part of why they do this is because they're absolutely miserable in their neighborhood. Right? They can't go walk by and talk to Mrs. Smith, on the front yard and stuff like that. They can't walk to the park because the mom thinks the cars drive too fast and they don't trust them to get there. We have designed so many things out of our neighborhoods. Our kids are really suffering, and I've seen it some with my own. So complete neighborhoods and building the full mix of housing is really important. Prioritizing infill development. This is from South Bend, Indiana. South Bend, if you've ever been there, is a pretty tired and aging place. They have a huge incremental development movement happening where all of these aging places, they've kind of loosened up their codes. They're working with local developers to come in and rebuild these places that bring in those different kind of housing, and that build wealth for the locals. So these aren't outside developers that are doing this. This is a guy by the name of Mike Keene that's built every project that you see in this picture is his. He was a college professor before he got into this. Learned how to do it, and now he's just replicating it one after another after another. So, there's a whole scale of development strategies here. You guys have some key sites. 635 is one, 30 is one, Harbor Point is a huge site that's an opportunity. So there's opportunity in Garland for all kinds of infill and redevelopment and new development at every scale. I think what this process is ultimately about is educating and engaging the community to help you understand the fiscal impacts of different development and how it needs to fit together, so that your staff can start to put zoning and other things in place to get more of the kind of things that you want in the places that you want them, and also make it harder to build some of the things that you don't want. But still, as a property rights state, if it's zoned something right now, they have the ability to build that by right. That comes after the comp plan to look at zoning. But you guys have the whole, Garland is so big, you have the whole spectrum of, you've got highway frontage in multiple contexts. You've got an awesome downtown that is really starting to go. You've got older neighborhoods that have narrower streets and grid that are kind of the bones for the kind of walkable mixed use places that young and old want to be to. And you have some of the more of the single family larger lot stuff that is still, people want as well, and they would love to have it closer to downtown and closer to a train station that they could get into downtown Dallas. So you have a lot of things going for you, but hopefully tonight we're just setting that foundation for how we're going to frame these conversations of what do you do with the land and the property and the buildings and the infrastructure that you have. What stays the same, what needs to be tweaked a little bit, what needs to be blown up and completely redone. Awesome. I'll stick around and answer more questions after this, but I want to make sure we let Maddie do her closing and let you all that want to go home and go to bed, like me. Thank you.
All right, so I just want to touch on some of the next kind of engagement opportunities that we have coming up. So this month we are going to have our second survey. We did get a question about the results for the first survey, so we'll be pushing out some updates to the project website. We'll make sure that the city gets some awesome infographics and things to help them promote those results as well. But that second survey is going to be coming out this month. We'll have some more updates regarding that on the project website. Our third survey is going to take place in November, and that's getting into what Kevin was talking about, sort of the local business environment. And then our neighborhood assessments, which are going to look at Garland on a more kind of granular scale, like more in-depth into the neighborhood specifically, will be taking place through December of this year through March of next year. And then we do have, as Kevin mentioned, the land use fiscal analysis, the LUFA results presentation. That is set to take place on December 11th. That is going to be a really helpful one. That is going to be covering a lot of this information that we went over tonight, but Garland specifically. If you could make it to one thing coming up, I would highly suggest looking into that and being there, because it's very important. It is the basis of what the work that we're going to be doing and things like that. And it's going to be helping us form a lot of these recommendations and actions that will be in the implementation chapter of the plan. Our next trip won't be until March. We'll have dates finalized for that pretty soon, and we'll get that updated on the website. And then we do have 2 more trips after that. So the next one will be in June of 2025, and then the last one will be in August of 2025 before adoption. That should be it for tonight, but I really want to thank everybody who was able to make it tonight, and we do really appreciate your participation and look forward to hearing everybody's ideas. So. Okay.